Hi, welcome back to my next entry in the saga of Game of Thrones' worst mistake, the marriage between Ramsay Bolton and Sansa Stark. Previously, I covered why exactly the Boltons' behavior was completely nonsensical, and how Peter Baelish bafflingly became the dumbest person in the room as soon as it was time to hand Sansa over to her worst enemies. But this time I'd like to go over the lost character arc of Theon Greyjoy. To be fair, Theon is still one of the best characters in Game of Thrones. His character and redemption arc is still arguably the best in the series, and the relationship that he develops with Sansa is one of the best in the show. However, that doesn't negate the fact that switching out Jeyne Poole for Sansa Stark did an enormous amount of damage to Theon as a character, as well as the entire story at large. A Song of Ice and Fire's author, George R. R. Martin, often says that every character is the hero of their own story. But the flip side of that coin is that every character is the villain of someone else's. And, while the Theon Greyjoy of the books is possibly even less appealing than his show version, one of the most interesting aspects of his character is his relationship to Ned Stark. Ned is widely considered to be one of the most honorable, pure-hearted, and heroic characters in the series. But what makes his relationship to Theon interesting is that he is legitimately one of the main villains of Theon's story. Theon may have been treated much better than Sansa was when she was in King's Landing, but he was still a hostage of House Stark and of the Crown. And he was always keenly aware of that. The Theon of the TV series seems to have a lot of internal conflict because he feels like he's torn between his two families, the Starks and the Greyjoys. But the Theon of the books is very distinctly not a Stark, and Ned Stark is very clearly not his father. The Starks of the books may be the most outwardly heroic family in the series, but they're clearly meant to be fallible heroes, and the person that Theon begins as, and the man that he chooses to become, is the most poignant example of the fact that, although Ned Stark and his family do try to be good people in general, they are capable of making huge mistakes that have tragic and far-reaching consequences. Reframing Theon's character arc around his familial relationship with the Starks, and making the catalyst for his redemption arc his trauma stemming from witnessing Sansa's rape and abuse, really serves to erase the abuse that Theon was subjected to, and also in large part removes his own agency and his decision to become a better man. It's an uncomfortable aspect of the books to acknowledge, but the reality is that Theon is a hostage of House Stark. He might be treated better than most hostages, but no matter how his cage is dressed, the Starks are his captors and his abusers. They're not his family. Theon at the start of the books is a massively unappealing character, but as he evolves over the course of the series, it's impossible not to question why that is. Because yes, Theon has been raised among the other Stark children, but in many ways, he's been raised by no one. He went through a seriously traumatic event, was torn away from his family, and had no parental guidance after he was severely traumatized, and his normal childhood was effectively ended because he needed to be used to control his family. Essentially, his childhood is a very direct mirror to Sansa Stark's. Ned did make an attempt to fulfill a parental role for Theon, but unsurprisingly it didn't work. And unsurprisingly, as Ned is wont to do, Ned ignored what made him uncomfortable and left Theon to his own devices. And again, while Ned tried to make Theon a comfortable hostage, the real trauma of what Theon experienced is exposed through his relationship with Jeyne Poole. For the front end of the story, Theon was a bad man who did bad things. But after experiencing true horror, he chose to become someone better. And in the world of Ice and Fire, this is actually incredibly unusual. Most of the characters who we see experience extreme trauma become worse people because of it. They become crueler, they care less, and they hurt more. So it's extremely telling that Theon goes through the opposite transformation. The contrast between Theon and the rest of the Stark children is laid bare in this redemption arc. Because the readers have already seen what kind of children that Ned and Kat are capable of raising. In a world full of terrible parents, they're sincerely good ones. But the fact that Theon was so terrible despite growing up in Winterfell isn't necessarily just an indictment of Theon as a person, but also demonstrates just how alone he was, and that the people who took him from his real family truly did nothing to raise him or parent him well at all. And that seems to be proven by the fact that Theon very clearly has a lot of good in him. Under the right guidance, in a world where he felt safe and loved, he likely could have been a very good person. However, he experienced extreme trauma as a child and was then left to his own devices. And the fact that Ned not only held him captive, but utterly and completely failed him as a parental figure, comes back to bite the entirety of House Stark. This is actually a masterful way of undermining the idea that the Starks, and Ned especially, are meant to be held up as some flawless paragon of virtue. But the TV series essentially alters Theon's redemption arc to give it the exact opposite meaning that it had in the books. Instead of being a traumatized boy who careened into adulthood and made every mistake he could along the way, he became a boy who was taken from his own family, but gifted with a better one. Instead of becoming a man who chooses to be more honorable, kind, or caring because that's actually who he wants to be, he's a man who's trying to make up for the wrongs that he's done to his adopted family. And instead of being a man who chooses to be good in spite of the fact that the Starks actually treated him very unjustly, he's a man who first chose to be bad in spite of the Starks doing so much for him, and who spends the rest of his life trying to redeem himself for that. Altering the storyline by replacing Jeyne with Sansa really robs Theon of all of his independent agency and growth, and gives the responsibility of his redemption over to the people who were in large part responsible for what a jerk he was in the first place. But that's not the only way in which Theon's character arc is massively undermined by the Sansa-Jeyne switch. One of the most interesting aspects of Theon's relationship with Jeyne is that prior to her marriage to Ramsay, they really have no relationship whatsoever. Theon doesn't have much of a relationship with Sansa in the books either, at least certainly not on the level that's portrayed in the series, where it seems like they're essentially siblings, but his relationship with Jeyne is even more distant. They essentially know of each other, but don't really know each other. Jeyne and Theon only really connect with each other because they're both horrifically traumatized and abused by Ramsay. But that makes Theon's character development much more meaningful. Ultimately, he's not traumatized by what he sees Jeyne go through because that's his sister being abused, but because he sees something happening that's objectively wrong. He doesn't decide to help Jeyne because he loves her, but just because it's the right thing to do. And while it's somewhat understandable that Game of Thrones didn't want to introduce yet another character into its already enormous narrative, one of the most important parts of Jeyne's character arc, as well as Theon's, is that this is happening to Jeyne Poole. In the books, Jeyne is masquerading as Arya. And there are many characters who mention that Arya's suffering, that Ned Stark's daughter's suffering, is weakening the Boltons' claim over the North. There are men who are coming to Winterfell to fight for Arya Stark's freedom, but Theon is the only character who's ever fighting for Jeyne Poole. Replacing Jeyne with Sansa undercuts the very heart of this storyline, because Sansa Stark is the kind of girl that people fight for. There's glory in saving someone like Sansa. People who don't even know Arya are willing to fight for her and risk their own lives because of who she is. But no one is ever going to fight like that for someone like Jeyne Poole. Within A Song of Ice and Fire, there are quite a few characters who believe that they're looking for redemption. But they mostly aren't finding it because their efforts lack sincerity. But Theon's redemption arc is the best in the story because of how real it is. It's something that he chose for himself, and something that likely won't ever matter to anyone besides Jeyne. But he's doing it because he genuinely wants to be good and make up for all that he's done wrong in any way he can. But when the show replaced Jeyne's arc with Sansa, it took away Theon's ownership of his own redemption. And it took away all of his traumatic experiences and all of the flaws within the Starks that Theon's character exposed along with it. Ironically, despite the fact that Game of Thrones largely tried to make Sansa's rape and abuse about Theon, it also took away the most meaningful and complex aspects of his characterization and development, and essentially altered his story so drastically that it became exactly the opposite of what it was meant to be. And unsurprisingly, he's not the only one. But I'll be getting more into that next time. But what do you think? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.